I went to high school at St. Ignatius High School in San Francisco. St. Ignatius was the prep school for the University of San Francisco, which was a Jesuit college. And the high school was run by the Jesuits. The Jesuits were, in those days, I do not know about today, but I assume the same, were great educators and had a very subtle process of how they went about the education of the student. It was a mentoring process that you were not aware of. It took me years looking back to realize how subtle the touch was and how they mentored each student, how every student had one or two mentors that were always there. This was a school that I could call up at 2 o'clock in the morning and call up my mentor and say, I want to talk. And he would say, come up. And in half an hour he'd be there shaved, coffee on, and we could talk all morning long. I learned a lot from that school. And I also rebelled a lot in that school. At the end of my third year, just as I was entering into architecture, and even before I knew that I would never even go back to school, that's another story to be told at another time, there was a conference of schools in the San Francisco area where all the major schools sent one of their teachers and one of their students to this conference to discuss education as a process. And the Jesuits picked me, probably partly out of understanding where I was coming from in terms of how I was determined to use what they had to offer me and at the same time maintain my own sense of my own education and my own path. And because of the many ideas that we had discussed over the time about how education should be done. When it came time for me to make my presentation, my basic argument was simple. That education for the student should be project-based. Those are the terms that we would use today. That there should be a mentor or homeroom teacher that would be very broad in his or her understanding of the students and of the curriculum. And that the curriculum should be the curriculum for a lifetime, not a curriculum for the 7th grade or the 8th grade or the 9th grade. This is what you're supposed to learn when you're this old. And that out of that curriculum, every student should have their own study plan. And that study plan should be a negotiation between the student and the teacher. A stiff negotiation. If you want to study this, understand that you need to understand these things, and I will help you find these things. Some of these are 2 or 3 grades in advance of where you are. But if you want to do this project, you're going to have to understand geometry. Also understand that out of the curriculum, there are things that you are missing. And we have to have a contract that in fact those things will be touched by this project in some reasonable kind of way. And then the student would enter into their year with their project-based learning. And that there would be deadlines and reviews, just like what happens in a professional office today. You have to produce your work at a certain time. And in the school would be the math teacher, the history teacher, the science teacher. And when the student came to needing understanding, his mentor would help him go to that teacher and learn what he needs to learn in the context of the application of the project. That was, of course, now almost 60 years ago, 54, 55 years ago. And experience-based and project-based education is beginning now to find its way into the classroom. I think this is an innovation long, long, long overdue. To try to pound into a student's head, out of context of application, abstract knowledge that in our society, most of which will not be knowledge at all by the time that student gets out of school, is futile. Particularly when the student has exposure through the internet, to everything that's taught at MIT, and to all kinds of information of all kinds. This whole notion of the didactic, this year, next year, this piece, learn a little bit of this, a little bit of that, out of context, unframed, is not working. And the dropout rate of the schools is a good indication of why it's not working, or that it is not working. There are some courses, like an art course, where traditionally hands-on, experience-based learning, project-based learning is virtually the only way to learn. It has been thought that maybe math isn't that way, or physics isn't that way, or literature isn't that way. But if you think of all of the different opportunities that exist in a school, art courses, literature courses, music courses, history courses, if one started to see those as an integrated system and started to look at how any project of any value requires an understanding of history, where did this come from? That any application of any art has a tale that goes back thousands of years. That it is not just what the society says today a student should learn. It is what society has learned over 10,000 years, and more importantly, what the student will know when the student is working in that society's future. One thing I tell educators, I say you're all futurists because you're the only people I know who deliver their product one generation later. It is one generation later that that student sitting at that desk in your classroom is going to be running a bank, designing buildings, automobiles, whatever, running for president, and that is your product. Just the requirements of today in the abstract form are not adequate in a world that is changing at the rate that our world is changing.